Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today to give members a summary of the Auditor-General's report into the expressions of interest process for tourism in public protected areas. And the key points of the Auditor-General's carefully worded but ultimately damning assessment are these. The report found that the consultation process for reserve activity assessments, and these are the internal documents that Parks produces, and we have a leaked copy of the Lake Malbina one here, is proponent-driven and lacks minimum standards. The report found that leases and licences are not subject to ongoing review. The report notes that the Solicitor-General advised the assessment panel that individual proposals should be submitted for his review, but, Mr Deputy Speaker, this has never occurred, and it does beg the question why. The Auditor-General's report found that the reserve activity assessment process is insufficient for complex proposals. Of the 22 reserve activity assessment documents audited, only 2 had complete documentation. Some evaluation reports were missing and key information was missing from activity plans. The report regularly identifies areas where documentation simply wasn't available. The report notes the absence of environmental conservation experts and members of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community that contributed to issues with projects receiving a social licence. The Auditor-General notes the decision not to replace the independent member of the EOI assessment panel after their resignation was unexplained. The expressions of interest process was meant to have a communications and engagement group, Mr Deputy Speaker, to work with stakeholders, but this group was never convened. The Auditor-General's report notes that the EOI process, probity advisor, should have not had any other involvement in the process, yet most of the external review reports commissioned in relation to proposals went to the same organisation that provided a probity officer. No safeguards were put in place to prevent a conflict of interest. The Auditor-General notes that Tasmania is the only state that allows for proposals that are inconsistent with management plans such as the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area Management Plan 2016, which was written in order to enable commercial development in public protected areas. The Auditor-General found that the scoring process was problematic, with proposals scores often allocated before vital information was received, potentially prejudicing final scoring. Because of an averaging of assessment scores, projects that failed one or more criteria could still be recommended for approval. The report noted that the panel did not have economic or financial expertise and that projects were often recommended to progress with poor quality or incomplete financial information. The Auditor-General notes that despite job creation being a key component of the communication and indeed propaganda around the expressions of interest program, there was no emphasis placed on this during assessment and the estimates provided to the panel were unreliable. The Auditor-General found that the jobs created so far by the Liberals' expressions of interest process are relatively minor. And Mr Deputy Speaker, this again is another damning indictment on an assessment process which has alienated bushwalkers, fly fishers and countless other lovers of the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. I do recommend members look at it, and this is in the same week, of course, that the Federal Environment Minister has agreed that the Lake Malbina proposal inside the walls of Jerusalem National Park should be assessed as a controlled assessment. And I just note that in the past 4 years, since the Liberals in government rewrote the World Heritage Area Management Plan, the management plan is very clear that there needs to be a fire management plan in the Twa. It has not been delivered, and in fact the discussion paper on a fire management plan in the World Heritage Area is only just being released now, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it is the same as the tourism master plan for the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. These two critical pieces of work were left to fall by the wayside while the Parks and Wildlife Service was politicised in order to facilitate the commercialisation and privatisation of Tasmania's wilderness. And how scandalous it is, Mr Deputy Speaker, that in a climate and biodiversity emergency, the government's Parks and Wildlife Service cannot could not deliver a fire management plan for the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area in under 4 years when we have had massive burns through the Twa. And that's because the government has diverted the resources of the Parks and Wildlife Service into this privatisation process, and other critical work has been left in abeyance. And that is a sad, sad day for the once great Parks and Wildlife Service, the fantastic people who are working out in the field for the Parks and Wildlife Service because they love the wilderness and the cultural values that they're tasked with protecting in their day jobs. But the management of parks under the Liberals has let critical work fall off the table, and only now, 4 years after a World Heritage Area Management Plan was rewritten to allow developments, only now are we starting to see some background papers on a fire management plan for the Tasmanian Wilderness World Heritage Area. Shame on the Minister for Parks. This has happened on his watch. He has a solemn responsibility not to privatise and degrade the wilderness with private developers, but to protect its natural and cultural values that are there for all to enjoy and for future generations. And they are our gift to future generations, Mr Deputy Speaker, and not this government and not the current Parks and Wildlife Service management. In future, this place is for all the people of the world. And I think that Minister Jensch ought to be ashamed of the fact that we only saw the Tourism Master Plan earlier this year and we still haven't seen a fire management plan for the only property on the World Heritage List that has wilderness in its name. It's something we should be proud of, it's something we should defend, and it is never something that we should privatise and give away for trinkets, Mr Deputy Speaker.